Well, let me start by saying I'm appreciative significantly of the opportunity to be able to share a little bit about what my book is on, and even more importantly, how it might apply relative to some of the challenges that organizations that do the diversity work are facing today. I've got, as my dad used to say, about 10 pounds of stuff to put in a 5-pound bag. So I'm going to bounce through this pretty quickly here on a couple of these to get to a few things that I want to make a point on. Number one, not interested in selling the book. That's not what drives me at all. At the end, I'll give you a link that you can go to get a free EPUB version of the book. My hope is that there's something in there that will be of value to you as it relates to either your personal journey, your organizational journey, or the leadership journey around how do we make sure that tolerance isn't the end destination, but that we drive that opportunity for people to disrupt the status quo with purpose, which is what the subtitle of the book is. Just a couple of things to give you my background in terms of the work, not an endorsement from anybody in any context, but just again to share with you, I've been doing this work for a little bit of time now. Context-wise, what I also wanted to share in this is a conversation about things that have legal implications, but it's not meant to be legal advice. So let me start filling the funnel with this pushback that we're getting in organizations now about the entire anti-woke movement, and unfortunately a lot of challenges around people who feel that what we're doing is not appropriate in the workplace anymore. How we got here? It really started with resentment to the backlash of having our first Black president. And as a result of that backlash, it took on its own life after George Floyd was murdered. And people started having, as you all know, these discussions around making this work more pertinent to what was happening in the daily lives of people who were people of color in the workplace as well. It then started to shift, as you started hearing as well, with people who were then hiring diversity professionals or hiring people to be their diversity professional. And we jumped right into some of those conversations with folks who were in these seats, turning up the volume on how to be an anti-racist and discussions on white privilege. As you all know, that didn't sit real well with an awful lot of people. And this was during the Trump administration. A lot of the white nationalists became emboldened, as you probably saw and heard pretty consistently on some of the conservative media outlets. All of a sudden, this pendulum started to swing the other direction from embracing the ways in which we need to be more accepting of our differences to this whole conversation about critical race theory and cancel culture. And I happen to live in one of the areas that this has become almost the daily rhetoric. So this roadmap, if you would, around this anti-woke movement was being laid. And we've become tolerant of it in a lot of cases. And that gets back again to why the emphasis of this book is on being tolerant is for cowards. And let me just share very quickly the title. The title of my book actually came from something the CEO of AT&T said. My beautiful bride worked for AT&T for more years than she likes for me to admit. And the CEO of AT&T made a comment, I believe it was after Michael Brown was murdered, and he was talking to a group of African-American employees with their national ERGs about the fact that we had become more focused on tolerance than doing something. And the way he framed it really sat with me. He said that it doesn't really take anything to be tolerant. All you have to do is do nothing. And unfortunately, that's what led us down this road. Let me give you just a little backstory, and then I do want to share direction and suggestions. My military background has taught me to never identify a problem without at least one proposed solution. So a lot of this actually came out of an executive order that President Trump issued. And within that executive order, it was banning diversity training. And it also started looking at anything that was diversity related as being anti-American. That executive order didn't last very long, but it did require those agencies to also make sure there was nothing with CRT or the term privilege or bias even in diversity training being given to both executive relative to this particular order, to those branches of the military that the government had control over from a federal standpoint, which meant all federal agencies as well as the military, again, federal. As a result of this, this particular executive order was rescinded as soon as President Biden took office. What happened next? Now the states jumped in. And any state that had a supermajority, which meant that their legislators, as well as the governor, were all Republican, they started linking this conversation of CRT and cancel culture to bills that they started passing to start to now create this backlash that we're seeing. Again, walking down this road and then hopefully teeing up a couple of, so what do we do about it? The legislation that was passed went through multiple states. It's impacting organizations. It's caused organizations to actually have a moratorium on their training. Multiple states have passed laws. Many more have laws that are pending already. Some of those that are pending may now be in that past category very recently. So Florida, in their supermajority with our governor, who is, as you all know, now running for the presidency, in this particular case, some of the edicts that he has signed have been put on hold by the courts. One judge even said it sounds as though Florida's trying to create their own ministry of truth. Within the context of those bills, it excerpted many things that were now overwritten in that federal legislation or executive order and now put it into place in states, prohibiting organizations doing some kinds of training and the kinds of things you see that make employees feel uncomfortable. Uncomfortable was the key word that's causing a lot of organizational angst. So what does it mean to feel uncomfortable? In some instances, it says that if the employee feels that the training is implying that someone is responsible, or if there were things done in the past by a certain group, whether it was race or gender or national origin, that because these things made an employee in the workshop feel uncomfortable, then it met the requirements from a legal standpoint to start mitigating that particular training and or be able to sue the organization who's doing that training. Again, that's the high level. I prefaced this conversation with, we've become tolerant. And that's, again, the premise of what I've written in the book about being tolerant is for cowards. So what can your organization do? Well, I've spent 20 years up until now living in Texas. I've recently relocated to Central Florida, but my background was in working in oil and gas. And when you work in those kinds of settings, you now have the facilities that produce oil and gas out in rural settings because of the incendiary nature of the production process. And the last thing that you want as an institution producing those oil and gas products is to have some catastrophic failure, and now it impacts people in their resident communities, especially large cities. So as a result, you've got a lot of what are referred to as working class Texans working in those facilities because they come from both the town side of plant and the more rural side of the plant. Well, even the word diversity, as it's pronounced in Texas, the conversation itself has been a very difficult one for years to have, long before anybody was discussing being woke or anti-woke or critical race theory. So I was in a position to go into those settings and have to still sit down and get them leaned in on this topic in a way that could be framed without having to worry about, one, were they being tolerant, or two, was this being politically correct? So the way in which that conversation was unfolded, I want to connect in this way, that unfortunately, we have a tendency to sort of frame what we're talking about in our work to be about how people believe. And the laws around what is being done specifically talks about prohibiting people who are now being taught what they should or shouldn't believe. And it's really not an employer's business to tell an employee what they should or shouldn't believe in the first place. How they behave, that's been more specific to what HR has administered for years. So that's where the focus of my effort has been, is in this particular book is giving some insights around how might you then approach this topic and what do you do institutionally to still make sure we're staying true to our precepts and being courageous from a leadership perspective. Well, one approach to eliminating this particular objection is I have rarely used the word diversity as it's pronounced in Texas, especially in the last 3 or 4 years. My conversational talk track is around the topic of respect. I've never met an individual in a workplace suffering from too much respect at work. And for those of us who do this work, even in the oil and gas sector, where you stand in front of an audience that's devoid of people of color in many cases, especially when you go further up that line, I've challenged them with that very same question. How many people do you see that suffer from too much respect? But here's how I stay true to the precepts around the work we do. Diversity still matters, but so does respect. And when you start to frame it through that conversation, now you're able to continue the dialogue without having to worry about that vocal minority. Just because they say the topic isn't important, they can't push back on the significance of respect. And here's how we stay true to our work. The ways we differ is how disrespect will often manifest, whether it be around an accent on a team that no one else has, or gender differences on a team, or educational distinctions. And I don't mean do you or don't you have a degree, but did your degree come from someplace that they perceive as valuable? My context of this, again, is we still have to stay focused on having these conversations because there's a significant disconnect within organizations around how important is what we're doing. The further up line you go, the more you look at those specifically white males in organizations, their perception of the significance of this is significantly less than those that would be referred to as knowledge workers who are younger and by default more diverse. And their expectation in organizations is that this is a significant issue. So if we start to yield to the politics of, is this indeed critical race theory, or is this indeed being woke or anti-woke, and now become leery of even having these discussions, we risk losing the best and brightest talent. And the context of the significance of this is everything that's happening in the media is telling us this is a significant issue. Respect is resonant in those articles being read by your executive leaders already. It's being cited in Forbes around the connection to career growth. It's being cited around leadership strategy. It's connected to things like the quiet quitting that's still taking place. The toleration clock is ticking is the context of one of the articles that was in Forbes. So this isn't just a conversation that we in the diversity space are having, but it's appearing within the media that most executives are also seeing. And when you ask those who are now in that Harvard Business Review assessment of what matters most to them within the workplace, respect from your boss tops the list. This isn't, again, being politically correct. The need for respectful behaviors could not be any clearer. And the importance of moving beyond being tolerant around this topic also means we need to find our voice and be more courageous. There's an impact. When you start looking at some of the things that are happening in the workplace right now, present state, turnover going up, quiet and quick quitting. Quick quitting is that person who lands today, but they had 3 job offers. And the context of what they experienced within the first couple of weeks tell them, this wasn't what I saw in the interview process. And they're reaching back out to the headhunter to see, are any of those other opportunities still available? At the same time that these issues are happening, organizations are cutting back on their goals, budgets. Pressures are now affecting everything in the organization, but this is a conversation that has a connection to all of those aspects of the business of the business. When people are feeling disrespected in the workplace, those of us that have any talent or people responsibilities have a choice. Do we simply swallow our voice and say that's the cost of doing business? Or do we find our voice moving beyond tolerance to say, these are the impacts on our most significant asset, our people? And for those of us who are coming in that discussion with the C-suite, we have to be able to champion, how do you now make the connection to their emphasis on margin enhancement and the kinds of things that are happening in the institutional culture that are affecting that already? This is not a soft, right brain, touchy, feely issue. This is an issue that can be fiscally quantified, can be connected to the top line, bottom line, and pipeline. And as a result, it moves from an issue of being tolerant to being strategic. Context-wise, the workplace respect and efforts at work are directly connected to every institution looking to drive increased performance and profitability. When at the University of Houston, where I ran the Institute for Diversity for over 20 years, we asked in a longitudinal study, what percentage of your best efforts do you give at work on a regular basis. 57% of employees stated that they give less than 100% of their best efforts. And when we ask what would incentivize you to give more of your best effort, pay, perks, and benefits didn't top the list. It was having a boss that treats me with dignity and respect. When we asked what would incentivize you to give more, what's one of the primary reasons that you did not give more? The next follow-up was, I tried, but it became expected and not appreciated. Workplace respect is not an optional issue. It has to become synonymous to what you see in a production environment. By that, I mean, you would never go into a plant that is a manufacturing facility of any type today, especially with all of the OSHA requirements, without watching a safety video. You wouldn't participate in a meeting, whether you're an employee or an outsider, that there wouldn't be a safety moment that either begins and or ends that meeting because it's in the culture. Until this topic of respect becomes as ingrained in the culture as safety is in a production environment, then it's seen as sort of a bolt-on instead of a must-do. Workplaces are changing today. And because of some of the differences in the workplace, people who have experienced disrespect to a significant degree in their professional or personal life are very intolerant of it when they experience it again. The context of this again is, once we become tolerant of these behaviors, they become the norm. Recently, in headlines, there are topics that abound around the toxicity levels in workplaces and how it's affecting every aspect of what we do as a business. Again, these are not articles that are talking about diversity as it's pronounced in Texas. These are articles that are clearly talking about how do we, from a business standpoint, ensure that what we are contributing is leading to the success of the organization. These are not ancillary issues at all. So being respectful also requires new skills. Examples, often when people feel disrespected, it's because someone is not listening to them, or those abilities to have conversations that are driving a end result, if you would, but not necessarily leading down that pathway of everybody's feelings getting hurt. How do you manage your boss? How do you hold effective meetings? All of these are the kinds of skills that are required in order to have a respectful workplace. Respect itself in the workplace is linked to people feeling as though they've been valued. Unfortunately, way too often, even in the hiring process or team selection, we still get stuck on those topics of comfort or fit when it comes to building or creating, if you would, our team or department. Many times those are code words for not accepting or respecting or valuing those differences. Well, workplaces are becoming so diverse that we can't afford to exclude anyone from bringing their A game to work. I tell people all the time that even though I'm not in Houston anymore, the University of Houston is the second most diverse four-year public university in America. I was astounded to find that the students there speak over 160 languages. That means you don't have to be a national or global business to have the concerns around how does culture now manifest when you're building respect into the environment. Because if you're just hiring from the local communities in those cases, you're automatically bringing a level of differences into the workplace. Again, being tolerant is not an option. The right tool and the right skill is required. My grandpa used to say all the time that if a person only has a hammer, then everything tends to look like a nail. Giving people the right tools, and what do you drive for institutionally? Let me give you some best practices in this case, as I know my time is running short. Many organizations are putting in place what are called RWPs, or respectful workplace policies. This begins to take us from just being tolerant of each other to now valuing those differences and hopefully respecting those differences. I tell people all the time that tolerance should not be the end game in the organization. I've been married over 30 years, and I can tell when my wife is tolerating me. It's not a good place to be. I'd much rather be valued or respected than tolerated. Let me keep moving. A respectful workplace policy, what it does is it provides some behavioral standards. It sort of puts life, if you would, into what you would normally see as maybe your ethics statement or something of that sort. It operationalizes it. It defines minimal behavioral standards. It takes off the table the ability for someone to say, I didn't know that was disrespectful. Employees actually start to develop these standards of expectation. So this is not something that as a consultant, I would come in and tell people what those expectations from an RWP are, or that you, those institutional leaders, tell those employees what it should be. They have to develop it themselves. Because at its core, what we're talking about is change management. And there's a dozen different change models that are taught in academic institutions across the country, but they all have a few consistencies. One of them being, if change is coming from the outside in, it's deemed to be compliance, whether there is some regulatory body, governmental agency, or leadership team telling them this is the change that you're going to now put into effect. But if the change is coming inside out and they develop and they now create the concepts around it, they own it. And the likelihood of success from that change is significantly higher. Keep in mind what these basically are is it's a social contract, and it provides enforceability around what are and are not acceptable behaviors. Now, the kinds of things from a best-in-class standpoint the organizations are creating these respectful workplace policies around include the areas where disrespect often manifests the most: in meetings, when communicating with each other, professional conduct. How do you demonstrate your commitment to coworkers? I love a quote that I found from Nelson Mandela. It says, "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedoms of others." On a personal note, I was actually moving to Johannesburg just before COVID hit. My wife and I had sold our house and had a house under lease as we were heading down there. COVID shut the border. I am so excited. We're heading back right after Thanksgiving. There is something special about the people of South Africa, but let me not divert. I have to continue to get through this before my time elapses. Let me share with you what is an RWP. And these are some examples of what an organization's employees have created in one instance. These are the kinds of things that now define what does respect look like. Let me give you an example. The process of creating these come through collecting data from the employees. And it's a matter of asking through a context of where they begin to feel vulnerable and are willing to share. If I were to walk into a room and see two people communicating eye to eye, what would I see and what would I hear that tells me that communication is respectful? Well, if it's peer-to-peer, these are the kinds of things that employees have cited in this particular organization as what does respect look like if you were to walk into that environment. I then ask, if it was a manager communicating with their employee, what would I see and what would I hear that tells me it's respectful? These are the examples they came up with. Thirdly, I ask, if it's an employee communicating with a manager, what would I see and what would I hear that tells me that it's respectful? Well, what you see here is specific to one organization. No two companies' RWPs are alike. But what I will tell you is often inherent within what is expected is that there are certain things people don't have the competency and skill to be able to do. So that's where the training and development now comes in order to create that opportunity for people to do what is expected of them. As I prepare to close, making change isn't easy, especially cultural. Adversity is also inevitable. And being tolerant is for cowards. Let me give you a thought when I talk about the inevitability of adversity. It's a core part of our work. But the next time you run into adversity, remember, adversity is like boiling water. And when you encounter it, you have a choice. Are you going to be an egg? Are you going to be a carrot? Or are you going to be a coffee bean? Well, what do I mean by that? An egg goes into the boiling water of adversity, fragile. But the water changes the egg and turns it hard. A carrot goes into the boiling water of adversity. It goes in hard, but the water that's boiling changes the carrot and turns it soft. But the coffee bean goes into the boiling water of adversity, only the water doesn't change the bean. The bean changes the water. Being tolerant is for cowards. Be coffee beans. Thank you for a chance to share. What I will tell you is what I began this conversation with as well. I am more than willing to provide you with a free copy of my book. All you have to do is scan that code. It should take you to the page to do that. What you will get is an electronic version of it not an actual hard copy. It is on Amazon and a bunch of other places, but again, I didn't write it for the purpose of selling. If it's helpful to you in any way, I'm happy to share.
Hi, Craig. That was amazing. We have a few moments for questions. I believe Geneva Green has her hand raised.
Absolutely.
Hello, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I love, I appreciate so much about your presentation and just some of the quantifiable evidence and just how you weave the story. So thank you so much. This was phenomenal. My question to you is, so I know that there are some places that many organizations have some frame of maybe not around respectable workplace kind of policies. I mean, well, they have some frame of policies and behaviors, right? I think what I've seen some
Yes.
of the challenges lie is just holding people accountable in the most basic ways. So even in the day-to-day, like meeting interactions, there's fears of saying certain things or holding people accountable, either management or different levels for their behavior, or the lack of the lack of respectful behavior. And then even on kind of oftentimes behaviors have to become extreme for people to be held accountable in some way, like it results in a dismissal or something like that. So what I'm saying is that the biggest challenge I see organizations having is accountability on a basic level and on sometimes a broader scale. So what are your thoughts on accountability? Having the respectful workplace policy sounds fantastic, and I love that it also sounds like it can be applicable across different cultural dynamics, international, foreign cultures, etc. How do you also encourage accountability?
Great question. Like anything, accountability in any instance where it's change oriented is progressive. So you don't jump in initially with delineating what are those RWPs and having clear guidelines in place. And anyone who steps over that line, they go into the first stage of progressive discipline after you've rolled that out. But indeed, that's the intent directionally. So just like anything that you're now putting in place, I'll go to the safety parallel again, that in an environment where manufacturing, and I'll make it personal, having worked in the Houston community where there were very lax safety requirements for a long time in the oil and gas facilities until several catastrophic failures took place, one in particular in the ship channel, that this one was in the mid to late 80s. And this, I believe, was a Shell property. The explosion was so intense that it registered a 3.4 on the Richter scale. And they found parts of this plant over 3 miles away. Over 25 people lost their lives. Well, as a result, when this got put in place, there was an absolute pivot towards not only is safety important, but we're going to do our homework to figure out things that they do now in organizations to ensure there's even fewer, if not zero incidents, is they have behavioral safety programs where people are actually walking the floor and watching to see how people are working, to see, is there something that we're doing that could potentially be unsafe? I pivot back to your question. Once you put those RWPs in place, and keep in mind, the employees are developing them. Now you've got the guidelines, but you can't start enforcing until you give people the tools to operate within those guidelines. So I'll give an example. If one of those particular guidelines is a way that is respectful, is me telling my boss, I've got too much on my plate right now, I just can't take anymore. Well, context-wise, that's not an easy conversation for people to have. So there is an absolute course and skill in how do you manage your boss. But very few people have ever been told or taught that. And the massive sound of kissing up is not managing your boss. So once you give them those skill sets, now when you tell them, here is what the respectful workplace guidelines look like and the tools that will enable you to stay within them. Now, when they step outside those lines, you do indeed, just like anything else, use a progressive approach where even utilizing techniques like the ouch to sort of stop a meeting when somebody has said something disrespectful and de-escalate once you said ouch. And John, I'm not really sure you meant that the way that landed for me, but what I heard when you said that sounded as though you meant everyone that falls into that category did or does, or did you just mean that person? And again, now you're giving tools, you're giving guidelines, but you absolutely have to hold people accountable when you step outside of those guidelines. We need to have a discussion on it and ensure you understand what's expected. And now you begin the process, just like any other guidelines that are clearly stipulated. When people step outside of them, they have to have consequences.
Thank you so much. I have one quick follow-up to that.
Sure.
So you're also assuming that, you know, we're just kind of formulating some of these policies with the help of the employees. What about those employees that are coming in and they're walking into this space where these workplace these respectful workplace policies are already in place, but they weren't a part of the development process? How are you also indoctrinating them or helping them to also align with it instead of it just being kind of a compliance thing for them as well?
Great question. The context of what I've seen in most instances with those who are onboarding, it's been rarely seen through the lens of, well, I didn't get to participate and contribute. It's almost the inverse, because it clarifies what may be, and I'm not saying that's the case in all, but most of us have had an encounter where, I'll go back to the Gallup book, First Break All the Rules, that people join companies, but they normally leave managers. And most of us have had an experience that was not the most positive of experiences. And when you're going into an organization that is defining what respect looks like, even if you didn't contribute to the context of what that definition is, in most instances, it is seen as an absolute positive, not a negative.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Again, copy of the book is available for free. I'm excited that they gave me this opportunity to share with you. If I can provide any insights, I'm accessible. I'm not selling anything, just being totally honest. I'm in the process of backing out of doing the work, diversity specific, and moving into the next stage in my life as I prepare to start transitioning into some more faith-based activities that have been really weighing on my heart. So if I can help with anything before I decide to hang my shingle out, let me know. I'm happy to do that. Thank you for this opportunity. And it's absolutely a joy to see so many people are participating.
Thank you, everyone. We have a few minutes left if there's any more questions. Feel free to unmute.
Ooh, I just saw something in the notes that said the QR code's been deactivated. I apologize. I did not know that. Just hit me with an email and I'll send an attachment to you. I'll send it to you. My fault.
Okay, well, if we have no more questions, then we will wrap up. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Craig.